Welcome, everyone. My name is Grace Mazzanti, and I'm a part of the Uncommon Conversations team here at Worldwide Clinical Trials, which is a global, full-service contract research organization. We're striving to have uncommon conversations all over the world on a variety of drug development topics to bring you best practices, recommendations, and more. Today, we're here with 4 industry experts for a discussion on how rare disease communities are being affected during a time of uncertainty. Now, here's your host, Jeremy Edwards.
My name is Jeremy Edwards, and I'm the Chief Commercial Officer of Raremark, which is a rare disease patient community and technology provider. The topic for today's webinar, which is brought to you jointly by Raremark and Worldwide Clinical Trials, is leveraging rare disease community during a time of change, such as the world is experiencing in this current moment with COVID-19. But perhaps beyond that, as the healthcare ecosystem will always be just that, an ecosystem that is subject to change and adaptation. I'm delighted to be moderating this discussion today, mainly as I feel my job will be easy given the caliber of speakers that I have with me. So with that, I would like to ask Talina to please begin the introductions.
My name is Talina Cook, and I am the founder of the Breeze Support Network.
Hi, Tammy Russo here, representing the Pharma side of patient advocacy. I've worked exclusively in advocacy for about a decade now at a number of pharmaceutical companies and biotechs, and also kind of sit on the other side of the bench as well, as I sit on the board of directors for a kidney cancer organization.
Thank you. And Jeff.
Thanks, Jeremy. So I represent the research community, working with a number of different clients, focusing quite a bit on real-world evidence these days, but Worldwide Clinical Trials is involved in early stage, late stage research on a global basis, and we certainly see a lot of opportunities to work with communities in a very positive way. So looking forward to our discussion today.
So the game plan for today is to get a perspective on the angles of the ecosystem for the various players. What are the gaps and opportunities for innovation? And with that, we will be hearing from a leading patient advocate about the role that they play, along with an advocate offering the pharma perspective and how they can participate. And then finally, I will come back and speak briefly about the role of technology, what it enables, the opportunities and challenges it provides. Once we finish that, we'll come back and pull all this together, focusing on trying to identify a win-win scenario for all parties who have been represented today. So without further ado, Jeff, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Jeremy. We've already, I think, used the word ecosystem a couple times in our discussion today, and it's not necessarily a familiar term, but I think it's very descriptive of all the players, as this slide suggests. And a citation here, I think, is Arlington Research Group. But indeed, there are a lot of participants in this ecosystem, citizens of the broadly defined healthcare community. And we've got obviously a few today with Talina and Tammy and myself and you, Jeremy, and not everybody's represented, but I think it's important to know that we're all connected in some way. I don't know if these lines are necessarily all connected. Frankly, it's probably more of a spider web than this kind of planetary depiction, because we all touch each other, and there's not one thing that any one of us does that isn't impacted by and doesn't impact somebody else in this ecosystem, whether it be regulators or professional associations, patient advocacy groups, insurers, healthcare companies, data vendors. And let's not forget, and I think appropriately in the middle of this ecosystem, are patients and providers. If we forget about patients, I think we've missed the mark completely. So again, I think we're all connected, and there's a lot of possibilities to optimize this ecosystem so that we can all get a lot out of it. Each of us has some different perspectives, and there is also the possibility of frankly and candidly, of working at odds with different members of the ecosystem. So I think a lot of these issues have to be put on the table. I think maybe even our discussion today will result in, Jeremy, I think you gave us extra points for being provocative. So I think we'll identify a few issues that are, that potentially are gorillas or elephants in the room. I think we can discuss them very candidly, but at the same time, I'm very optimistic about this ecosystem, that we can indeed get everything that each of us and each of the perspectives we represent out of it. It may be a scenario of linear programming where ultimately we're optimizing the whole system. We each have different perspectives, but leaping ahead to that last item on the agenda, I really think there are some true win-win opportunities. I think there are some great overlaps in perspectives, and I think we all know what the right thing is. So that, from my standpoint, is kind of a good enough start to identify the landscape that we're all playing in.
Thanks, Jeff. That's a great start in terms of putting us all on this map as citizens of the ecosystem. So with that, Talina, as a citizen of patient advocacy, how do you plug into this?
Patient advocacy groups have become very important in the healthcare system. The Breeze Support Network, which I founded, is an online peer-to-peer support group network, and it's for those who are dealing with pulmonary fibrosis. The goal of our network is actually to foster connection, education, and inspiration for our worldwide pulmonary fibrosis community. We have found that we achieve connection by utilizing the Facebook platform. This also allows us to be available 24/7 for anyone around the world. And currently, Breeze Support is represented in 99 countries. This goes a step beyond our regular face-to-face support groups that we see because we are available 24/7, whereas a face-to-face support group might only be available a couple hours once a month. Our network is available to anyone interested in learning more about pulmonary fibrosis and anyone who is a patient or loved one affected by the disease. Pulmonary fibrosis is a widespread but little known terminal lung disease, and most people have never heard of it until they've actually been diagnosed or they know somebody. So it's a tough one to deal with. PF is not well understood in the medical community. So this makes the online support group networks very valuable. The patient advocacy that's out there definitely helps the patients manage their day-to-day issues. So people join our groups, they learn more about the disease and how best to manage it. We don't give medical advice, we're very careful with that. But what we do is we help educate people who are facing this disease so that they can better advocate for themselves and for their loved one. We help them find important resources. We help educate them on what they might expect as their disease progresses. And we help educate them on how to best care for themselves so that they can stay as healthy as possible. To give a couple of examples, during the recent pandemic, the support groups have become even more powerful in helping patients. We have a lot of patients that need to get pulmonary rehab, and this usually requires them leaving their home. And during the pandemic, they haven't been able to do that. So because we allow also healthcare professionals and many from industry in our support group, we have a number of pulmonary rehab specialists in our network. These specialists have been able to set up online pulmonary rehab programs so patients can actually continue their rehab from home and they don't have to leave their house. It's helping our worldwide PF community stay more healthy while they're being stuck at home during this crisis. Another way that we help support the PF community is by allowing more interaction with our pharmaceutical experts. I recently got involved with a pharmaceutical company that is working on a medication to help alleviate one of the major symptoms of PF. This should allow for a better quality of life for our patient community. Because I have been involved in this as a patient advocate and been able to share this with my PF community, we've been able to get more people involved in the drug trial and also more people involved with talking with the pharmaceutical company about how this symptom affects their lifestyle. So we're hoping that this fosters better drug development with the pharmaceutical because they'll be able to communicate closer with patients and know exactly what the needs are. Our goal is to continue getting as many as we can from industry more involved in the online support community so they can see firsthand how patients and loved ones manage this disease. We all want a cure, obviously, for this disease and other diseases, but while we wait for the cure, we need better quality of life for our patients. And that is mostly what our patient advocacy and online support is about, is having better quality of life. Because we are peer-to-peer, our patients and loved ones also inspire each other on a day-to-day basis. And this is very helpful. My past experience with my mother, we were very much alone. She didn't have anybody else with PF to talk to. I didn't have another caregiver to talk to. So developing these relationships is very important. And people form friendships. They learn from each other. It is truly peer-to-peer. And they don't feel alone because they know somebody who is going through the same thing as them. So our online support communities have really added value to the lives of patients and loved ones. And, they've given back quality to their lives through connection, education, and inspiration.
Thanks, Talina. Turning to you, Tammy, with the pharma advocacy hat on, how does pharma connect with patient advocacy groups like Talina's, and what do you hope to achieve?
It occurs to me listening to Talina's presentation that I spend the vast majority of my working hours, that is the one that I'm wearing the pharma hat, really advocating for patient advocacy within pharma, which kind of sounds ironic, but really I think that there's a lot of movement toward the trend of patient centricity, and it's absolutely PC. You have to have that in your corporate vision statement, and it's got to be reflected in your mission and so forth. But unfortunately, I think a lot of times it's just the pre-required verbiage as opposed to putting your literal money where your mouth is. But it is about a lot more than money. So I think really it's establishing the conversations and determining what symbiotic goals can be met. The truth of the matter is that the goals of the patient advocacy groups are not going to be completely overlapping with those of pharmaceutical companies and vice versa. So from a patient advocate standpoint within a pharma company, I feel it's our role to determine where can we meet in the middle, where can pharma help the advocacy organizations and communities, whether they be online or virtual, if we ever are lucky enough to get back into the opportunity to have person-to-person support conversations. Where can pharma best play a role? Where can we best support? And obviously, pharma is a business, let's be honest. Likewise, nonprofit organizations need revenue to be able to survive and keep their doors open, whether those doors are virtual doors or concrete doors. So there is an element of fiscal interaction here that is one of the many elephants in the room. So I always feel that it's better to address those elephants as opposed to wishing them away or trying to occlude your vision to the point where you can't see the elephants. So I think some fundamental steps in the right direction towards creating partnerships is, first of all, to base those partnerships in trust in a sustained sort of way. I think many pharmaceutical companies out there have relatively, I won't say short-sighted with a negative implication, but a short-term objective. I need to find patients for this trial. I need to go in front of ODAC and I need a patient testimony. Those are certainly initiatives, they're tactics, but they're not representative of the sum total of support that pharmaceutical can, and I would say should be, supplying to the patient community. I very much am an advocate of advocacy to the point of everything should not just be patient-centric, it should be patient-driven, which is a much more active sort of looking at things. One of the elements that I recently created was kind of the realization of a professional dream I've had for much of my career. So as I mentioned earlier, I wear two hats. And it occurs to me that many patient advocacy organizations have impaneled a scientific advisory board. And this is representative of community and research clinicians who are at the forefront of treating patients. And as such, they're experts that absolutely bring value when they're consulted. I always wondered why pharma didn't take that model and turn it on its ear and impanel an enduring body of patients for the same reason. And so I just created that. And it's a patient council, if you will. And the company that I'm working for right now, I've created, or I will be creating, one for each therapeutic area that we have proof of concept, right? So proof of concept from the pharmaceutical standpoint means, yep, we've identified we have a molecule that has the potential to aid a patient population. That doesn't necessarily mean it's yet approved or available to patients, but we have something that looks like it could be a winner. So we're going to commit to this disease area. Once we get there, it's absolutely critical, and I would argue it's critical far before we get there, to not only engage with patients, but to do so on a sustained basis. And whether those patients are individual patient opinion leader, which I would say Talina absolutely would be a representative of, whether they are patient advocacy organizations, and I feel those are both a target for communication and a medium from or through which communication can flow, or whether they're individual patients or D, all of the above. So once you know as a pharmaceutical biotech company that you're in it and you're going to stay in it, those relationships become that much more critical for all involved. And so it's been really my delight, and I'm so excited to report at least initial success in engaging this enduring population, this enduring panel that represents a number of different types of patient voices. I think that's the other really important thing for pharmaceutical companies to remember, and that is, and Talina, you'll probably recognize this as well, if you've seen one patient, or especially if you've seen one rare disease patient, you've seen one rare disease patient. Each patient is an individual. Each patient represents different demographics, different concerns, different needs. So much that what you'll see on the screen now is a representation of a number of different pharma and biotech pages on their website that are dedicated to advocacy, right? And it's delightful that there's a commissioned resource here. What you'll also see is there's actually an organization that's sprung up in the last 5 years or so that is so invested in the importance of patient advocacy, especially in the rare disease community, that it's created to impanel and to actually validate people who do what I do for a living. So there's a multi-day course with then some follow-up work, and you can actually become certified as a patient advocate. That's how well entrenched the value, at least from a rare disease community, is. And I don't want to continue to drone on without allowing for opportunity for some of my other panelists, but I think we've seen that the rare disease patient communities are often instrumental in so many ways that other patient communities can learn from. And I think it's because so many times the rare disease patient community has to struggle even for its own diagnosis. Oftentimes, through their own independent research, they are more sophisticated and able to speak to the needs of their disease than oftentimes are the diagnosing or treating clinicians. And so it really all circles back to the absolute value and need of the organizations, and more importantly, at least from Pharma's viewpoint, the absolute need to embrace and learn from these patients, and to remember that it really all is about patients.
Thank you, Tammy. I think it's clearly obvious that finding that harmony between the various entities is absolutely critical to finding these future treatments and cures. Also, an excellent parlay into what I'm going to talk about now, which is around technology and how it can enable and impact much of what you all have already spoken about. Because as we know, shift does happen. So understanding what that means from a technological perspective is critical. Understanding the role of pharma and patient advocacy groups and communities is critical to ensure that that appropriate technological shift occurs. As you mentioned, it's all about patients. And it's one thing to have the benefit of patient advocacy groups and landing pages, but then we layer on branded pharma product sites, brand and marketing agency pages, Insta, Face, Tweet, TikTok, the rest, and things begin to get muddied. But we know at the core that these caregivers, these parents, these patients, they want and need options, but more importantly, they need genuine community. And by that, I mean a community of patients with shared experiences, shared struggles, and a common goal to find a cure or at minimum an improved quality of life. The challenge then becomes in how we create that experience while simultaneously connecting those users to industry organizations that are instrumental in developing these therapies. But we've got to do that without branding it like a NASCAR. We know that the authenticity of these communities when they're out and about is absolutely critical to their longevity and to their return from a patient perspective. When I look at it, it begins by recognizing that the patient, the parent, the caregiver can't and should not be segmented as a clinical trial subject and then moved down the conveyor belt as a marketing research participant and then ultimately passed along as a real-world patient. Instead, it's one patient, one unique journey, ideally encapsulated in one technological platform. We know from our own product line, as well as the research we've done, that on average, a rare disease community member will spend just under 90 seconds per web session engaging and looking at content. Now, they might come back multiple times over the day or over the week, but at any one point in time, it's about 90 seconds of engagement that you have with them. We also know that less than 1% of community members are actively looking for clinical trials when they initiate that web instance. So they're coming out, they're looking for others who have experiences, they're looking for guidance, they're looking for someone to speak to. And then they are potentially presented with study opportunities. And that's where you have an opportunity to engage them from a commercial side. But that percentage is quite low. We also have general demographic stats in terms of the prevalence of female over male in terms of communities and their activity. But what it shows us is there is no one-size-fits-all community approach, nor is there a one-size-fits-all approach to patient engagement, patient recruitment, or patient retention. As my panelists have mentioned, the rare disease patient is just that, rare. They typically approach things different. They're more engaged. They're more willing. So we have to approach them differently as well. One of the things that's unique in some of the technology that we're offering is the ability to not just go deep with the indication, but also go wide from a rare disease perspective. So what I mean by that is a mother of a neonate with a rare disease will have things in common with another mother of a neonate with a rare disease, regardless of what that potential indication might be. So there's shared learnings and experiences that technology offers parents, patients, caregivers to interact across indication as well as going deep into that indication. So understanding that and putting together a model there is really critical. And I think that's where companies like Raremark and others come into the mix. Is Pharma has realized in the past 4 months that on top of the difficulty of finding patients and enrolling rare disease patients, they now have seen the immediate vulnerability that a traditional site-based model creates. The literal flip of a switch, the machine was turned off. As we know, sites were shuttered, studies put on hold. And I think that created a focus on a better way to conduct these programs, which eventually leads to that technological solution or shift. One example recent from my perspective is an IPF program where we were able to go out to these patients, engage these patients, and figure out exactly what their expectations are in terms of getting back into trials, getting back into sites, getting back in to see their doctors, and then working with that client to create truly a virtual experience, not just a hypothetical conversation, but actually putting something into practice where they can meet these patients at home, do the appropriate tests, et cetera. So blending a host of patient-focused solutions that draw on all the things that Talina and Tammy have talked about from the patient advocacy side and the pharma side. Those things with an appropriate behavioral science model and some artificial intelligence, that creates an environment where patients can visit, share, and learn from one another. But more importantly, it creates a customized journey that these patients can experience, which again makes their entire experience in a particular community more enjoyable. And further to that, it allows us to provide real-time data for clinical development as well as post-marketing and everything in between. So essentially, I think the technological shift is, at the end of the day, you've got a global rare disease research-ready network where patients can be engaged online. We can reach patients in their home. And we essentially allow industry to meet patients where they are. So whether that be a traditional trial, a virtual trial, a longitudinal study, branded, unbranded product launch, the shift towards technology has already occurred. And from my perspective, I think the current world today will only further accelerate that. So with that, I know at this point we want to bring in some more free-flowing conversation and questions. So I'm going to turn it back to Jeff to start us off. And really the question there, Jeff, is from a win-win perspective, which we talked about at the beginning. Do you think that is possible given what we've talked about here today?
Technology is fascinating, but I thought you said online community instead of online. I think a lot of the online and on-wine communities are starting to merge these days. So that's a win-win situation. But but again, I think there's so many different examples of win-win scenarios, and a couple of things we haven't mentioned that regulatory agencies are finally, I think Talina, you'll have some thoughts on this, finally starting to recognize that patients are kind of important. Patient quality of life is important. We need to develop drugs not just with traditional efficacy and safety endpoints. We need to think about what matters most to patients. So there is obviously an initiative these days, patient-focused drug development, that the FDA is taking very, very seriously. At the same time, the FDA has also, and regulatory agencies have also embraced the science of real-world evidence and the importance of tapping into different data sources, whether it's directly from patients or electronic medical records or whatever. You mentioned a little bit, I think both Tammy and yourself, Jeremy, about patient recruitment and how we can perhaps work with online communities to optimize, improve the efficiency of patient recruitment, recognizing that not everybody wants to participate in a traditional randomized clinical trial, but there may be a lot of people who would be fine to lend their day-to-day experience into a database, which is kind of what, I guess the granddaddy of patient communities, patients like me, are all about. We have to think about what motivates a patient to share their experience. Perhaps it is, how do I stack up with other people like me? When we think about aggregating those data for use by a pharmaceutical company or other researchers to really understand the evolving landscape, what's the evolving standard of care? I know a lot of our clients are fascinated with the changing standard of care as a result of COVID pandemic. The shift from face-to-face interactions to telehealth is not just a technological shift, but it truly may have an impact on and may constrain patient treatments, patient outcomes. So many of our clients are asking us to look at those differences before and after. Hopefully there will be an after. And I think the win-win, the goal that Pharma has in developing very important products that can advance treatments, maybe even work towards cures, recognizing who those treatments are for, patients, regulators being the watchdogs for patient safety. Let's not have drugs out there that aren't fully researched. I think one of the positive things coming out of this whole pandemic is there's a greater recognition of the importance of true science. We just can't snap our fingers and develop a vaccine. This takes time, and it takes heads down science to get this done. So representing, I guess, the research community, we see some great opportunities for win-wins between all the players, or at least many of them in the healthcare ecosystem. Some of them have developed products and services. For example, I look at electronic medical records, not necessarily developed for research purposes, but we can turn those records on their sides and pour out some fascinating aggregate data that can help us really understand the landscape of disease. Anyway, I think there's some great scenarios, and maybe we can talk more about them in our Q&As.
I completely agree with Jeff. We need more patient-focused drug development, and we need better patient recruitment. We need to understand more what the patient actually needs and wants. As Tammy mentioned, clinicians don't always know exactly what a patient is going through day to day. Clinicians spend a few minutes to maybe a half an hour with a patient every few months. And so they don't have that knowledge of their day-to-day experiences. I went through that a lot with my mom. What her doctors thought she was going through and what she was really going through were completely different. So we need a better understanding of that, and that requires getting more communication with our patient community and with our caregivers. Caregivers see things from a different angle. What a patient sees or remembers is often different than what a caregiver sees. We need to partner with pharmaceuticals, and that's something that is going to take some time to try to develop a good, trusted partnership between the patient caregiver community and the pharmaceutical community. We need to realize that pharmaceuticals are there to help us. So that is something that I think that we really do need to work on. And maybe Tammy has some more thoughts on that as well.
Absolutely, Talina. Pharma has to earn the trust, right? And oftentimes that means having conversations that are not easy to have. That means not shying away from conversations about pricing or access. I sat on my first day of work at a pharmaceutical company, which shall remain nameless at this juncture, team meeting, and we brought in an outside party to facilitate and to kind of determine what the mission and vision of our team would be. And I had come from another pharmaceutical company that really was very embracing of all of those tough situations, and recognize that to have a true relationship as opposed to a transaction, you needed to have difficult conversations at sometimes. So I brought to the table, I said, well, I think we need to plan for situations where that may be necessary. And my boss said, yeah, we're not going to do that next. And I thought, oh my, I've signed on to the wrong job. This is not going to be a good alignment for me. And it's a tough uphill battle to tell pharma companies you have to give patient organizations, patients themselves, some negative news. But the truth of the matter is, especially as it relates to online capabilities, whether they're communities or Dr. Google or C, all of the above, patients are so much better and so much more proactive. So to assume that a patient is not going to find out about a price increase, or a patient is not going to find out that a pharmaceutical company has had challenges with some insurers' coverage is really ludicrous. And if you are intentionally, you being a pharma or biotech, intentionally trying to duck those conversations, you are just paying lip service to your patients. So you really have to walk the talk in these situations. And I would say that the FDA, in my humble opinion, needs to do so as well. So patient-focused drug development is a wonderful initiative. What I'm personally chomping at the bit is to see what the follow-up to that looks like. What's going to be done with that? And I'm not yet privy to what that will look like coming through the other side, but I'm oh so excited to learn about it.
Do you feel like that pharma truly understands the patient's journey from a rare disease perspective in terms of what they go through, the physicians they go through, the journey to diagnosis? Do you feel like there's a gap there that could be filled to help with this entire process?
I do, and I feel like there's, and Talina, I'm sure you're going to be the best informed to speak to this, but I feel that there's not a single gap, there's multiple gaps. One thing I've seen come back on every single piece of patient market research is a request for better dialogue with their treating and diagnosing physicians. This is absolutely universal, regardless of disease state. Probably even more so in the rare disease community. But if you look at the way clinicians are trained, the focus on communication between physicians and patients, it really isn't there. So I think anything that pharma could do, and this is a real long range plan, but anything pharma could do to help facilitate that dialogue is really going to help serve all needs better.
I completely agree, Tammy. One of the things that we talk about a lot in my support groups is how to get good care while trying these drugs that are out there for the disease. Many of the clinicians don't really fully understand these drugs and how they affect the patients and how to counter those effects. So I'm always telling my patients in my groups to go back to their pharmacist, go directly to the drug company if the drug company has any kind of nurse support system or anything, because their clinicians aren't always the ones who really know how to deal with the issues. And when you have patients who they're all excited to try a drug because it's going to slow the process of their disease, but try that drug and the side effects are so incredibly horrible that they quit using that drug, then what's the point? So we need pharma first to understand better what a patient needs. We need drugs developed that also enhance quality of life for patients or don't at least decrease quality of life for patients. And we need clinicians who have better understanding of what the patient's needs are as well and what a patient is actually going through. Clinicians, when they prescribe something, they prescribe based on science. This drug should do X. And if X happenings, all is okay. But what they're not looking at is they're not looking at the actual overall systemic effect on a patient. And that is a real downfall in it. So we definitely need that. When you talk about educating patients on what it takes to create a drug, that is something that we definitely need more of as well. In the patient community, many people don't really understand what it takes to create these drugs, not just the process, but the cost involved. So when these drugs are released and the cost is high, they look at that as a very negative thing. We need to be educating them more. We need to be talking to them more and helping them to understand that this is a process, that many of these drugs don't even make it to market, and what that process is and what those costs are. So having those difficult conversations is very, very important. And it's something that we need to start doing more with the patient community.
And I think I always found it fascinating when I first got into this field 100 years ago that the conditions under which drugs are used are not exactly perfect representation of the conditions under which drugs are researched and tested for approval. There's a recognition that the real world patient experience is real important. It may not be easy, and there's certainly a lot of analytical challenges in understanding what the real world's all about. The real world's real important, but the real world can be real messy too. But patients are the source of that information. And I think more and more clinicians recognize that clinical trials are critical, obviously, of importance in getting regulatory approval, and we need these experiments. But then drugs are used differently. Patients aren't perfectly compliant. Many patients who actually get a product would have been excluded from a randomized clinical trial. So the connection between patients, patient advocacy, bringing patients together, mining and aggregating that experience data is extremely important. I think many, if not most, pharmaceutical companies recognize that real world evidence is real important. And again, I think this is where they're one of those examples of a win-win with greater enlightenment among everybody, patients as to the drug development process, physicians as to the limitations of clinical trials. But that said, we're not going to snap our fingers and get everything solved. I think it's ultimately a lot of baby steps, but I'm optimistic that we're going in the right direction.
I would agree, Jeff. I think from a technological perspective, we've got the ability to really start to understand that patient's journey, what they're going through. We see it quite frequently, and it's sad in many instances how many years it takes to get to a diagnosis and how many physicians they're bounced around from. So you've got an opportunity there to collect some valuable patient insight that can help pharma. But on the flip side, you can then go back to these patients who are participating in this research. And even on the health economics side, you can begin asking and engaging them questions in costs of care and burden of illness so that then, Talina, they start to understand, well, this is a costly endeavor. There are so many variables that drive this. And I think there's almost a 360 type relationship there within a properly built solution where everybody gains, everyone benefits, and everybody becomes more educated around what's truly happening. So that's just my perspective. We're coming up here close to our end of the time. One more question I wanted to put out. We've talked about the patient side of things. I just want to get in there thoughts on the FDA's guidance on patient-focused drug development. Is that useful? And just quickly get some insights on that real quick.
I'm with Tammy. I am anxious to see the end result of patient-focused drug development. I want to see that changes are actually happening, and that's what patients and caregivers want to see as well. Having the FDA talk about it is great, and it gives us hope, but we need to actually see what comes of it.
Okay.
I can say that our clients are taking it seriously. They're seeing the FDA get pretty upset if there isn't a plan for developing a patient-focused drug development program using the appropriate, whether they be quality of life or other humanistic instruments, a recognition again that this may not be truly how the standard of care will evolve within the construct of this clinical trial. But I can tell you that our clients, large pharma, small biotech, everybody in between, are taking it seriously. And they're not just throwing in a quality of life instrument just for yucks and just to check that box. They're recognizing that maybe the agency is actually providing some leadership. I do have the same kind of skepticism that Colleen has expressed, but I'm optimistic that they're doing it the right way methodologically. They're encouraging it, and at least our clients are taking it seriously. It's an important endpoint. Clinical endpoints are important as well. Economic endpoints are important. So I'm optimistic that it's, Tammy said earlier, it's not just lip service. I think it really is a sincere effort. Do they truly understand it? Well, maybe that's another question.
So I'll just briefly say that I think not only do I support everything that's been said, but I think we can go beyond that as well and perhaps take some lessons from our European colleagues who now have a regulatory requirement to publish data in patient-friendly language. That's something that my company is embracing now, but I think I'd love to see more widespread pull-through of this. So it's not just there is patient research, and I think Jeremy, you said earlier, the patient goes into the void at that point, but you can pull those messaging and the ultimate results through so patients can have a better sense of what they're contributing to, where there was a good outcome, maybe where there wasn't, as opposed to just blindly, well, yeah, I volunteered for that. I gave of my time and my effort. And gee, I never heard whatever happened to it. So I think we do a better job of closing the loop in that manner as well.
And we know there's an industry commitment to be transparent in clinical trial results, but that can be, to your point, Tammy, pretty technically, pretty jargon-esque. And even if we bring in the patient-focused element, there's a net change on a quality of life instrument from 6 to 3. What does that mean? So speaking in the patient's language, being able to accentuate the conversations that, Jeremy, your company perpetuates, the groups like Talina are working in, I think that's a really important element.
It is a very important element. Coming from the patient community myself, trying to put those trials into layman's terms takes a lot of effort. And I spend a lot of time doing it when I'm trying to share information about trials or, studies that have happened. They really need to take the time to put it in everyday language so that everyone really understands it.
I agree. Well, before I close us out, are there any final comments from any of the panelists that you would like to share?
COVID-19 is starting to bring us more together, and we're doing more of these panels because of that. But technological advancement has happened, and the opportunity to bring people together electronically, the opportunity to look at data differently, to improve the whole efficiency of the clinical trial process is an exciting thing that's been moving even before COVID-19. It's accelerating some things that are happening, and maybe bringing us together from a philosophical standpoint is great as well.
And I guess all I'll add in closing is that these types of conversations are needed to provide the foundation. So the more we have them, I think the better off we'll be, the more we're able to socialize them through technology, just kind of coming full circle again, the better off we'll be. And, I'm trying desperately to find silver lining in the situation that we're all living through, the entire planet is living through at the moment. And I think one is ease of learning from each other. Certainly we have to be open-minded as to how that learning occurs, and it may not be elbow to elbow the way it was, but we have opportunities like this to have discussions that have enduring value when they live on elsewhere on the web.
I completely agree. We have really had an opportunity the last few months to challenge our technology and see just how far it can really take us. And I think that we as a community around the world have found that there is so much we can do with technology to help bring us all together and help get us all on the same page. So I think that this has been very helpful, actually. The one silver lining around all of this.
We recognize that we all play a different role in this ecosystem, but I think it's fair to say that the key here is the patient, keeping the patient first. And if we do that, these things will in fact work themselves out. So thank you all for joining today and appreciate it.
Thanks for listening. It's our hope that you found this webinar to be thought-provoking. If you have a topic that you would like to learn more about and have some uncommon conversations around, please feel free to email lindsay.johnson@worldwide.com. Thank you, everyone, and have a great rest of your day.